So now, I, with pleasure, introduce our first speaker, Dave Sherry. He's the author of the recent book, Russia 1917, Workers' Revolution and the Festival of the Oppressed.
Good morning, everybody. I'll start by echoing what Emma said in her introduction. That the October 1917 revolution is the high point of human history. It's the most powerful social movement of all time, the most successful anti-war movement so far, but most importantly, for the first and so far the only time, workers in Russia, a major country, took and held power for a significant number of years. The rule was based not in the democracy of parliament, but in Soviet democracy. Workers, soldiers and peasants' councils created during the course of the revolution and created from below. Ordinary people made the revolution. It was actually Russia's third revolution in 12 years, so they had practice. 1905 saw Russia embroiled in an imperialist war with Japan. It also saw mass strikes, peasant uprisings, mutinies in the army and navy, and the first ever workers' councils, the first ever Soviet. At the end of 1905, the Tsarist state crushed the 1905 revolt. But 12 years later, in February 1917, Tsarism was toppled in less than 2 weeks. And then 8 months later, the Soviets went on to topple the provisional government that had replaced it and take power. For the revolution to succeed, the revolutionaries were clear that made the revolution, the workers themselves were clear that it would have to spread, and spread it did. Out of the bloodbath of a war came the possibility of a new world. 1917 inspired the uprising in Ireland against the British Empire, and that spread to a colonial revolt across the world. So powerful was the spread of the revolution and the movement that it engendered that it ended the First World. It was powerful enough to end the First World War and topple 3 other great dynasties: the Kaiser in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire ruled by the Sultan in Turkey. In 1919, there were workers' councils across Germany, Italy, Hungary, Austria, and even the royalty here and their cabinet were worried that they would be toppled by Bolshevism too. You can read Lloyd George's memoirs. It's not made up by revolutionaries. And that prospect of world revolution really was on the agenda until it was finally crushed and extinguished by the barbarisms of the 1930s and 40s. And today we celebrate the Russian Revolution against a backdrop that's as grim and terrifying as the world that Russia's workers rose up against in 1917. The 1914-18 war was the key element, if you like, the spark for it wasn't a revolution in Russia, it was a revolution across Europe. With the exception of the war was really capitalism's solution to its crisis of profits. And the competition switched, if you like, from the boardrooms to the battlefields with the poor. It's cannon fodder everywhere across the world. With the exception of the Bolsheviks and a few other brave individuals across Europe, the trade union leaders, the leaders of social democracy, the European labour movement, supported their own ruling class and abandoned their internationalism that they trumpeted up until the outbreak of war. When the war happened, they caved in. Russia's semi-feudal autocracy was incapable of conducting a modern war, unable to feed its people, humiliated in battle, and reluctant or unwilling, completely unwilling to share even a modicum of power with anybody else, it crumbled and fell apart under pressure in as I say, 2 weeks. The revolution was made not by the revolutionaries. They were taken by surprise. Revolutions have a habit of starting with fairly simple basic demands, but then they take a dynamic and a momentum of their own. And really that's what happened. It caught the revolutionaries out. The Tsarism that had ruled for 300 years, brutally for 300 years, seemingly all-powerful, fell in 12 days because of mass strikes, peasant land seizures, insurrections, and mutinies in the army. We're told that revolution is a male thing by a lot of people. Actually, 1917 was initiated by the women textile workers of Petrograd, and throughout Russia's Red Year, women played a key role in different aspects of the revolution. And it's only now that some of this is coming to light, and I've tried to include it in my book. With the Tsar gone, an unelected gang, really, of liberal capitalist politicians moved in to fill the vacuum at the top of society and grab power. They called themselves the Provisional Government. They were led by a man called Prince Lvov, and they were out really they talked about defending the revolution, but really they were out to restore order, to modernise Russian capitalism, and to keep Russia in the war and fight the imperialist war alongside their allies. But from below, a radical challenge to them arose in the workers' and soldiers' councils, the Soviets, the Russian word for that. Lenin called this state of affairs dual power and predicted it couldn't and it wouldn't last very long. In April, he returned from exile in Switzerland back to Petrograd to argue against a conservative, timid, cautious Bolshevik leadership that there needed to be a second socialist revolution, that the provisional government that was supporting the war had to be overthrown, and so his slogan, "We all power to the Soviets, down with the war," caught an echo, particularly among rank-and-file workers who were dissatisfied with the provisional government. And Lenin was to be vindicated 6 months later in October. The Petrograd Soviet had formed the day before the Tsar was toppled. And Soviets spread across Russia like wildfire. It's reckoned that by May there were 300 Soviets, that by October itself, there was August 800, and by October itself, 1,000 Soviets. And the more stronger the Soviets grew, the weaker the provisional government seemed to become. It looked doomed, actually, in the summer of 1917. But the question was, would it be overthrown from the right by a military dictatorship, or would it be overthrown from below by workers' revolution? Surprise, surprise, in August, the generals moved to crush the Soviets, the revolution, the provisional government, and to restore military dictatorship. To their credit, the Bolsheviks were able to mobilise and arm a united front to defend the Soviets in the revolution against the military coup, and they succeeded. Had they failed, I think it's Trotsky wrote that the word for fascism would have come into the language not as an Italian word from 1922, but a Russian word from August 1917. The United Front had managed to stem reaction, but it was for the time being. Throughout the summer, by and large, the militant workers, were ahead of the Bolshevik leaders. They shaped the party as much as the party shaped them. Between February and October, the party grew from an estimated 20,000 members to 400,000 members. But the truth of the matter was the Bolsheviks didn't really know the party was growing so fast and mushrooming rapidly. And it was based very much inside the workplaces and inside the regiments in the Navy, the people fighting at the front. How are we doing for time? By September, the Bolsheviks had a majority in the major Soviets, the major army units, the fleet, and in the factory committees. And after a big argument inside the leadership of the party on the 25th of October, the Petrograd Soviet called an insurrection against the provisional government, and it was overthrown very easily, and the Soviets took power. The new government launched what was far and away the most radical, far-reaching programme of change ever attempted, and it pulled out of the war. And I would argue that never was such a radical programme attempted anywhere in such a backward country and in such straitened circumstances. Russia had just been through 3.5 years of war, destroying its economy. Then, in January 1918, it was faced with a civil war, launched by the old ruling class, the generals, the pro-monarchists, but funded and armed by Western capitalism. 14 armies invaded Russia to destroy the Soviet state and to really restore a military dictatorship. Regardless of that, the Bolsheviks went ahead with their most radical programme. The first decrees were to endorse workers' control, which had happened already in the course of the revolution, and to immediately transfer the land to the peasantry. This wasn't like a white paper or a government inquiry to transfer land as we're used to in parliamentary democracy. It was enacted right away. The Soviets simply said, peasants, take the land, it's yours anyway. But probably the most remarkable feature of the revolution, I want to spend a bit of time in it, is that they launched a programme aimed at the full emancipation of women. Russia became... women were given equality in employment and rights. Divorce was made freely available to either partner. One of the features of the revolution had been to win workers away from backward ideas, from the ideas of national oppression that had happened under Tsarism, from the ideas of religious persecution that happened against the Jews and the Muslims, which were 10% of the population, and above all, a radical transformation in the old sort of age-old family, and attacking the ideas of attacking sexism, misogyny, homophobia, superstition, to win workers away from those ideas. And that was reflected in the revolution itself, and it was particularly reflected in the legislation about women's liberation and the legislation about sexual liberation for people, a fundamental part of the revolution. So much so that Lenin could write, after 2 years of the revolution, a short quote. He said, in the course of 2 years of Soviet power in one of the most backward countries in Europe, more has been done to emancipate women than has been done during the past 130 years by all the advanced, enlightened democracies of the world. I mean, this was no exaggeration. 1917 really was a festival of the oppressed. The decree in self-determination gave the oppressed nationalities new rights, including the right to secede from their federation. Russia under the Tsars had been known as the prison house of nations. Under the Soviets, it was a federation of free and equal peoples. Anti-Semitism, which had been the bedrock of Tsarism in dividing the population, was outlawed and challenged, as was the persecution of Muslims and the persecution of their religion. The education system was revolutionised. There were massive investment in the building of schools and cultural institutions. Russia saw a mass literacy campaign, a ferment of innovation and experimentation in the arts, and showed what socialist revolution, even in a backward, beleaguered society, could achieve. The revolution did spread to the more advanced West. And Europe came close to revolution on several occasions in the next decade. But Russia was the only place where the revolution triumphed. And by 1921, Russia was isolated. It survived the Civil War, but by the end of the Civil War, the economy had been destroyed. The working population had been reduced by 50%. The output of the economy was reduced by 18% of its 1914 levels. So the idea of Soviets and the idea, let alone socialism, could not happen in Russia in 1921. It required the revolution to spread, and it didn't. What we take from it is this, that the reason the revolution is unique, the reason it happened and the reason it made its enormous gains was largely because it would have happened, the events would have happened without Lenin. There's no doubt the anti-war struggles in 1914, the strikes, the mutinies, the movement for national liberation, for sexual freedom, would have happened without Lenin. Lenin's strength and genius, if you like, was his ability to see that these movements could be pulled together into a fight to challenge capitalism and overthrow it itself. And his legacy was a party that, though rooted at first among a minority of workers, was able to grow and win the majority of people to a revolution to transform capitalism. The absence of such a party and such an organisation and such bold revolutionary leadership and all the revolutions and revolts that have challenged capitalism since then to now, from Germany in 1918 right through to the Arab Spring in 2011, shows us why Lenin and the Russian Revolution are so relevant today. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Our next speaker is Sally Campbell. Sally is editor of Socialist Review magazine and also author of Rosa Luxemburg, A Rebel's Guide.
I think it's fantastically important that socialists celebrate the revolution as Dave just described it. Because I think if you just got your information from, for example, the main BBC TV show about the Russian Revolution, you would think that it was a coup organised by three people. The Bolsheviks consisted of three people, Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin, who were all on the same page and had a plan, were kind of power-crazed despots who used the masses, if the masses are mentioned at all, by the way, to their own means to end up in charge of Russia. It's portrayed generally, when the revolution is talked about at all, it's talked about as, at best, an experiment that went wrong and didn't have any kind of legacy. And at worst, of course, in the way that people like Orlando Figes and so on described it on that BBC programme. And I think that it is a really widespread view now. The revolution has been called, one author of a recent book called it one of history's great dead ends, like the Inca Empire. Like it's just this aberration that happened 100 years ago in very specific circumstances that really has nothing to say to us a century on. And I think if you're a school student today doing GCSE history, you still spend a huge amount of time discussing Rasputin and his mysterious influence on the Romanovs, and not really any time discussing the concept of, the new industrializing working class in Russia and the role that they played, or the role of, the peoples of the East, the Muslim populations, the women workers in places like Petrograd, and all of those things that Dave has talked about. And so I think for a lot of young people today, precisely those kind of people who have been attracted to Jeremy Corbyn and, the kind of the sense of wanting an end to austerity, wanting an end to the kind of war-ridden, unequal, unjust society that we live in, I think the Russian Revolution can seem very remote. And I think it's our job to try and draw the lessons from a century ago. Because, of course, Imperial Russia is a very different society from 21st century Britain or anywhere in the world today. But does that mean that there's nothing we can learn from it? And I think that now is a time when lots of people, in Britain, of course, we see it around Jeremy Corbyn and the massive growth of the kind of the Labour Party and the movement around that, people looking to ideas of socialism, but not just here. Even last year there was a survey in America which found that over half of young people identified socialism as a good thing and capitalism as a bad thing. This is not just the era of Donald Trump, it's also the era of Bernie Sanders and all those kind of figures who represent something very real about wanting to change the world. But how do we relate something like the Russian Revolution to those events? And is there even a legacy for a world which is very different? And I think, when I'm trying to think through that question or answer that question to someone today, I would start from the kind of world that we live in, that we still live in, I would say. Of course, lots of things are different, but lots of things are the same. When you think about what Theresa May said in her speech a few weeks ago, a free market economy operating under the right rules and regulations is the greatest agent of collective human progress ever created. It is unquestionably the best and indeed the only sustainable means of increasing the living standards of everyone in a country. In Britain, one of the richest nations in the world, official forecasts suggest that the average worker will earn less in 2021 than they did in 2008. And that's just for starters, isn't it? The fact that she's saying this kind of thing just 3 months after the Grenfell Tower fire, where 80 people at least, more than that, have lost their lives and hundreds of people have been made homeless because of privatisation, because of money grubbing and profit motives and sheer negligence, that is kind of nauseating that we still have a party of government that tries to justify the system as it is. But I think on a global scale, these things are even more extreme. In January of this year, Oxfam produced the report that they've been doing regularly for a while now, looking at income inequality in the world, showing that the 8 richest people own as much wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people on the planet. We say these figures a lot, but you just have to keep saying them because it's difficult to actually get your head round what that really means. There are 8 people, 8 men, most of them Americans, I think, who own as much wealth as half the world's population. And actually, that bottom half of the world's population is struggling to get by. In the past few years, we've seen an increase in the kind of extreme weather conditions, that we've seen the hurricanes and so on that are destroying lives in places like the Caribbean, in South Asia, while you've got someone sitting in the White House who still won't admit that climate change driven by human activity is a thing, While we're talking about Donald Trump, of course, there was a little reminder yesterday of the power of a working person who managed to shut him up for at least 11 minutes anyway. And Trump, when he's using Twitter and making his pronouncements, it's not just the casual kind of pronouncements that he makes, but, the war of words that he's engaged in with North Korea, the whole kind of, sense of global doom that really just emanates from people like Donald Trump at the moment. So when people say the Russian Revolution was a failure, I think we need to say capitalism fails every single day. It fails on a fundamental level. It does not meet the basic needs of human beings. It doesn't meet the basic needs of half the world's population, but it doesn't meet any of our needs. No human being actually is really fulfilling their potential while we live under this system. It's economic inequality, it's wars, lead people into situations where they are turned into refugees, where they then try and find safe haven and find themselves locked up in camps or drowning in the Mediterranean. And even in, countries like our own, and across the world really, you think about things like the epidemic of depression and anxiety and stress that people are facing, when the services really aren't there to deal with that. I think capitalism puts the entire future of the planet in jeopardy. When you think about environmental disaster, and time and again, governments across the world sign up to these treaties with kind of meagre targets of cutting emissions. Normally they don't even meet those, but of course even if they do, it's not really sufficient to deal with the crisis, and they're never really enforced. And the alternatives that are sometimes put to these kind of global problems that we all need to deal with are so minimal, and so often don't really challenge the fundamental dynamic that is at the root of all of these problems. So, when it comes to climate change, there's often, people talk about technological solutions and so on, when really it is the fact that we live in a society where a minority of people own and control the wealth and what is produced and how, and they're competing with each other and they're exploiting the rest of us. That is the reality of our system. And it's not only about exploitation and resources and so on, because capitalism is also a system that has at its heart a level of oppression and division that's constantly being renewed and kind of remade and reshaped in different circumstances. Sometimes that is very obvious and brutal, things like the Rohingya massacre in Myanmar recently. You can see the horrific kind of mass-scale violence that comes out of imperialism. And in other cases, it's more of a kind of constant daily grind of undermining, of feeling undermined, of feeling belittled, of feeling, not equal to other people. And sometimes that, of course, spills over into direct violence as well, when you think about the young black men who've lost their lives on the streets of Britain at the hands of the police, or the Muslim women who've been spat at in the street or attacked and worse. And at the moment, all of those women who are talking about their experiences of sexual harassment and assault and so on, and you think about the Me Too campaign across social media recently, how prevalent that is. And none of these things are accidental. None of these things are just about individuals relating badly to each other. None of these things are about men being men or any of these other kind of explanations. These are all structural problems, at the heart of our system. And I think that this is something that brings us back to why the Russian Revolution is so important to celebrate. Because, none of these issues are new. Many people have fought for women's liberation, all of their lives. They've fought for, sustainable, renewable energies and so on. All of these things, people have fought for civil rights, have fought against racism, and often won, bits and bobs of all of these things. But actually the system always attempts to reassert itself, and reshape and refound those oppressions and those divisions. And reforming the system just isn't enough. In the past century, since the Russian Revolution, we've seen a whole number of left-wing governments elected in different parts of the world at different times. We've seen all kinds of liberation movements and so on. And they've often been able to achieve something. But what they haven't been able to do is legislate away the basic brutal truth of the system that we live in, which is that it is a capitalist system based upon the exploitation of the vast majority by the extreme minority. And that is what is at the heart of all of those issues that we face. And the way that minority maintains its control is, in part through the state, those institutions of violence that they're able to bring out when necessary. And the Russian Revolution, and specifically the October Revolution, confronted that truth head on. It did not duck it. It did not try to go around it. It took on that question directly. And for a period, it showed how it might be possible to run a society differently. Of course, in just a few years, there wasn't enough time, to build the perfect socialist society or whatever, but there was enough to show the potential for a society where there is no more exploitation, there is no more class. And when you read accounts like John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, Louise Bryant's 6 Red Months in Russia, these kind of things, you can see how those processes took place so quickly and how people changed themselves in the process of changing the world around them. And I think when you look back at our world today, you can see those same processes at work. You can see the ruling class using the state and using violence when it has to impose its order on things. So Catalonia is the most obvious recent example, isn't it? Firstly, in Catalonia, you've seen some examples of the potential for workers to organise collectively and make a real change in society. So during the referendum campaign, you saw the dockers in Barcelona at a mass meeting deciding not to work on a ship that was housing officers from the Spanish National Police and the Civil Guard who were coming to try and shut down the referendum. You saw the Trade Union Federation calling a general strike, and we all saw those images of the firefighters in uniform, in their ranks kind of defending people's right to vote for self-determination should they want to. And it's interesting, really, that the Spanish state and the European Union and its member states really can't cope with this concept of democracy and people wanting to have a say about how they are governed. And, because it's a threat to the order that they want to impose on things. And so we saw the Spanish state mobilise the armed bodies of men that Lenin described a century ago to smash the independence movement, to arrest the leaders who, by the way, have been a brilliant example of the limitations of bourgeois leadership when they all ran away to Belgium. But, I think the Catalan crisis has really exposed how much the workings of the state at heart are the same as they were when Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Russian workers were having to confront those questions a century ago. Because the Bolsheviks didn't have this problem when it came to the question of national liberation, as Dave has talked about. They understood it as something that was absolutely fundamental to defend the principle of the right to self-determination. That's not because they wanted to see the nations of the Tsar's former empire kind of split up and separate off and go their different ways. It's because they understood that unity under the banner of socialism has to be voluntary and it has to be won politically. It can't be forced with borders. Working class unity isn't about borders, it's about common interests. And I think that in the course of the October Revolution and a few years that followed it, you started to see how oppression has absolutely no place in a socialist revolution, because you could see how central all of those things that divide us had to be wiped out of the way in order for the whole movement to go forward. So I think that what happened in Russia in 1917 was absolutely the opposite of what had come before it in terms of the Tsar's empire, which was known as the prison house of nations, which oppressed all kinds of national minorities, which oppressed people's religions and languages, a society that was viciously racist and in which the kind of ideas around women's role in society, and gender and sexuality were incredibly conservative. But I think it's also the complete opposite of what we see today, whether it's from the European Union and the Spanish state trying to influence, impose their will on the people of Catalonia, or whether it's, Trump attempting to ban Muslims or the Prevent programme here in Britain. Any of these things, are all an example of how the state wants to trample on people's self-determination, really. And I think the Russian Revolution was at a profoundly different level to simply trying to reform things and make them a bit better within the current system. It was a bottom-up transformation of society which saw all kinds of oppressed groups come to the fore and be part of shaping the world. And I think as long as working class people try to organise collectively and try to take on and challenge the will of those who run our society, then I think the Russian Revolution will always have something to say to us.
Our final speaker this morning, before we open up for discussion, will be John Molyneux. John is author of the recent book Lenin for Today, and he's also editor of the Irish Marxist Review.
I want to start by talking about St. Petersburg. Not St. Petersburg in 1917, but St. Petersburg in 2017, where I went in August. And especially having come from Dublin and remembering what Dublin was like in 2016, the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising, when actually you couldn't move in Dublin without seeing traces or celebrations of it or references to it. Going to that event, you didn't always agree with the way they did it, but they were there. When going to St. Petersburg, it was extraordinary the way in which the revolution had been erased and how little there was about it. Just off the Nevsky Prospect, the main street of St. Petersburg, the main street of the revolution, there was a Harley-Davidson convention. I have to tell you that, sadly, the Harley-Davidson convention was more in evidence than any commemoration of the revolution. You went to the Winter Palace, to the square in front of the Winter Palace where Bloody Sunday happened, in which they stormed and all the rest of it. And there were characters, they have for the tourists, walking around in costume. Not Lenin and Trotsky, I'm afraid. No, the Romanovs. There was more about Peter the Great than there was about Lenin and Trotsky. I mean, that is the sad truth of the matter. Now, one understands why that is, given the nature of Putin, and Alex Callinicos' article in the IS Journal talks about this, the orphaned revolution and how Putin felt about it. But you also have to say that whether you're talking about Ireland or here or anywhere else, actually there is a deafening silence about the revolution, really, in terms of commemorating it. And underpinning that silence is the dominant narrative about that revolution, which exists in the academic world. It's accepted uncritically in the media. I didn't see the BBC programme, but I'm sure it informed that I heard from people and so on. I want to say a few words about that dominant narrative. That dominant narrative says the Russian Revolution was not a workers' revolution. It was simply a seizure of power, a coup from above by Lenin and his fellow professional revolutionaries and conspirators in the Bolshevik Party. That's the essence of what they say. Worth saying, however, that dominant narrative didn't arrive spontaneously. That dominant narrative was constructed, and there's much more to it than that, it was constructed over best part, I suppose, 70, 80 years, particularly by the American ruling class, with the aid of former Russian counter-revolutionaries, embittered Mensheviks and so on, who knew the record, through Harvard University and Yale and so on, and they constructed a narrative that went all from Lenin's teenage years through what is to be done through the split with the Mensheviks and so on, right up to the Constituent Assembly and so on. A whole story focused on Lenin being power mad and Lenin grabbing for power and concentrating all power in his hands and so on, etc. And we think today of Orlando Figes and so on, but there's a whole generation of such people who were involved and made huge careers in the academic world out of constructing this story, going back to people like Leonard Shapiro, Bertram D. Wolfe, Boris Nikolaevsky, and so on, all the way back. It was when I first looked at the revolution in around 1968, that story was all there in place back then. The reason, though, we have to understand why this narrative has such traction, including with a lot of academics, is because it appeals to that, fundamentally, to the idea that, of course, working class people couldn't possibly have emancipated themselves. That just is not a possible thing. Don't be so naive. Of course it must be really business as usual, one or other set of rulers just grabbing power and so on. So it appeals to that. And therefore that narrative gains attraction with people and the support for people and can pass as a plausible account, even though it will not withstand any contact with the actual facts of what happened. When I say any contact with the actual facts of what happened, I don't mean if, like Dave, you've done serious research and read the whole story and written about the whole story. I don't mean if, like Steve Smith, who's speaking later, you've done original research in the factories in Petrograd, or like Kevin Murphy in America, his research on the Moscow metalworkers factory and so on, and you've gone and done. I don't mean that kind of knowledge. It doesn't withstand any contact with the main well-known facts of the revolution, or the actually thinking about what happened for a few minutes. And if you break from this idea that ordinary people can't do anything. Look, let's start with some very, very simple things. When the revolution begins, neither Lenin nor Trotsky nor any of the other leading revolutionaries are even in the country. So Tsarism is destroyed by an uprising that is not in the slightest bit directed from above. Secondly, by the time you get to June, there are mass demonstrations in St. Petersburg around the main sort of Lenin, Bolshevik slogans, etc. To everybody's surprise, already by June, the workers of St. Petersburg want to take power, want to end the war, want to get rid of the provisional government, and so on. By July, they're actually trying to do it. Physically, they're actually beginning to move towards insurrection. And Lenin is saying, no, hang on a minute. It's too soon, because he knows that it's not good enough just to have a majority in St. Petersburg, or you would end up like the Paris Commune. One city and you'd be smashed. So he's having to hold back the workers. Lenin doesn't even begin to contemplate actually organizing insurrection until after the workers have defeated Kornilov, the attempted counter-revolution, in late August and September, destroyed his armies, prevented that counter-revolution even getting off the ground, and the Bolshevik program has won a majority in the Soviets nationally. It's only then that he even contemplates insurrection. And then you get the insurrection itself. It kind of amuses me almost what people think. They say, oh, well, there wasn't much street fighting. They don't have the barricades. They didn't have the mass demonstrations and so on. Ask yourself this, right? Imagine that a group of revolutionaries, us, if you like, a few thousand revolutionaries, marched on Downing Street. You marched towards Downing Street, or Buckingham Palace, or both, right, and tried to occupy them. What would happen? Why don't we do it? Yeah. And we know why we don't do it and why nobody does it, because the Metropolitan Police would come and smash your heads in. Of course they would. I mean, they would do that to a bunch of students who were just kind of protesting about fees or something. Never mind revolutionaries trying to occupy the place and depose the Queen or whatever. Of course they would. They would smash your heads in. And if there weren't enough police to smash your heads in, they'd call the army, obviously. So why didn't they do this in Russia? Lenin and his Bolsheviks had this coup. Why didn't they do it? Everybody knows why they don't. They don't think about it. They didn't do it because actually the Soviets, the workers' councils, and in particular the Bolsheviks, had won over 9/10 or more of the army and of the navy and of the workers. There was nobody to defend the provisional government. That is a real revolution. That is an extraordinary revolution of working people. One thing you can see in St. Petersburg today, is still there, I don't know how much longer, is the Aurora battleship, parked on the Neva, the great river. Right? In October 1917, they sailed the Aurora up the Neva, parked it outside the Winter Palace, where the government was, and said, unless you hand over all power to the Soviets, we're going to bombard you. Now, can people imagine this? Lenin rang up the generals and said, look, we've got a little plan here. You're going to tell the battleship. Can you imagine what would happen if we tried to get a battleship to sail up the Thames? It happened because the sailors of the Aurora, and they weren't an exception, were 100% behind the revolution. That's why it happened, because they were absolutely committed to all power to the Soviets, to taking power themselves. It couldn't possibly happen any other way. So the dominant narrative is a nonsense, and often it's believed on the left. I was in Dublin. I saw an advert for a meeting. It said, "Come and hear about the workers' revolution in Russia that was destroyed by Lenin." Now, I won't go into all the facts about it. There's a chapter on this stuff in the book. But think about it. Right, the Tsar couldn't destroy the workers' revolution. Kerensky couldn't destroy the workers' revolution. The police couldn't destroy the workers' revolution. Right? The foreign armies that invaded Russia, and the white generals couldn't destroy the revolution, but Lenin did. How? How could he? I mean, that again is that behind this is the view that working class people are just fools. Oh, he did it through the Bolsheviks. Who did they think were in the Bolsheviks? At the beginning of 1917, the Bolsheviks had a big enough membership, 20-odd thousand, but still tiny, you know, in the larger scheme of things, but overwhelmingly factory workers. By the time you get to October, they're 300,000, 400,000, we don't know, something like that. All the sources insist they were factory workers, overwhelmingly workers. You're not talking, there wasn't a party of intellectuals. There were maybe 50 intellectuals or something, and hundreds of thousands of workers. So Lenin somehow managed to con the workers to destroy the workers' revolution. It doesn't make any sense. So that's the fundamental point I want to make, and I have to wind up. So just the last 2 points I want to make is this, that it was precisely because the Russian Revolution was a revolution of workers' power that it had this immensely inspirational effect around the world. It was as a Soviet revolution, not a Russian revolution, as a revolution of workers' councils that it spread all the way to Limerick in the west coast of Ireland. People were forming Soviets. The Welsh Valleys, people were forming Soviets. They weren't probably really technically Soviets. That's not the point. When they occupied a creamery or they took over their town, they called it a Soviet because that's what it meant. Soviet, how workers take power, and it had this enormous inspirational effect before people ever read Lenin or Trotsky or anything like that. That's what it was. In the same way that in 2011, when people saw the Egyptian revolution, they saw it was naive in a way, but they saw people occupying squares and making a revolution. So what do? They go and occupy squares in Madrid and Barcelona, and then they go and occupy squares in New York and so on. That's what they see, and that's what inspires them. And what they saw was workers taking power, workers' councils. That's what we're going to do. And there's one book which really brings home to me the meaning of the revolution as a revolution of ordinary people, of the oppressed rising up. And it's a beautiful book. It's called To See the Dawn. It tells the story of the 1920, the first Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku on the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan. Amazing event. I mean, it was attended, this event, by all sorts of delegates from all those places, sort of romantic names, but not very romantic places, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on, from across there came to this conference. It was also attended by John Reed from America, who went to Baku and denounced American imperialism there, by Harry Quelch, a British communist, who went there and denounced British imperialism in the area, and so on. But it's the pictures that are really so wonderful. Here you can see it, and I'm looking at it here. You have Najia Hanoum proposing a program for the liberation of the women of the East. You have the delegates at the Red Army Club, many of them in turbans and so on. You have delegates of the Sarts. Anybody here heard of the Sarts? A town-dwelling trading people of Central Asia, sitting cross-legged on the floor with their turbans. The demonstration of Baku Women's Union, August 22nd, 1920. The banner on the right in Azerbaijani text reads, "Long live the world revolution." The Russian text links liberation of women with liberation of the world's toilers, and so on. And then you've got Bibi Noor, who was one of the leading women delegates there, who is in traditional dress, and Kaveh Shabanova, who is has a hijab, sitting on the stage with the presiding committee and so on. And then there's another photograph, I'm going to conclude here, of Congress delegates, quite a few of whom have got the swords and the knives in their belts and so on. Yeah. And I just say, for those people, for the people of the East, who then, as now, were the overwhelming majority of people in the world, the Russian Revolution was this beacon of their own liberation. Now, we know it ended in the nightmare of Stalinism. Can't time to talk about that now. Other people will talk about it. But is that not worth celebrating and remembering? Is that not relevant today? I believe it is. Thank you.